Hello everyone, thanks for attending this special IUCN session on marine connectivity conservation. My name's Simon Pittman and I'm a research associate and teacher in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. I collaborate with the Seascape Ecology Lab that was set up by Lisa Wedding in 2019, where we focus largely on applied connectivity research and also mentoring the next generation of seascape ecologists. In this presentation, I'll briefly explain what I mean by seascape ecology and how seascape ecology helps us to understand seascape connectivity and how we map and measure seascape connectivity. I'll give a brief overview of a couple of examples of integrating connectivity into conservation planning in tropical coastal seascapes, and then provide some future research priorities. Seascape ecology is essentially the application of landscape ecology concepts and techniques to the ocean and coastal environments. Like landscape ecology, seascape ecology is pattern oriented. It's the study of ecological causes and consequences. And key to this is the linking of structure in the environment with function and change, the dynamics of systems. And landscape ecology has probably contributed more than any other subdiscipline of ecology to our understanding of connectivity, at least at operationally relevant scales. And a key characteristic of both landscape and seascape ecology is working across spatial and temporal scales. And it's an integrative subject, so it lends itself to transdisciplinary working and borrows methodologies, integrates methodologies from many other subjects. And in doing so, seascape ecology and landscape ecology generate quite different questions about nature than do other subjects. As an integrative and solution-focused science, the scope of seascape ecology is inevitably broad, but four major themes characterise much of the research. I call these the 4 C's: context, configuration, connectivity, and the consideration of scale. These themes are interrelated, and when considered simultaneously will likely deliver a more complete picture of an ecological system than could be achieved by a focus on any single theme alone. Using the seascape cube here as a static representation of dynamic structure, let's start with context, with the simple premise that local conditions are influenced by attributes of the surroundings. This encompasses the influence of the patterns and processes surrounding a focal site in both space and through time, i.e. the historical ecology. As such, context can include the human dimensions, which we sometimes refer to as the 5th C for culture. Generalities may exist, but growing evidence suggests that we need to consider that unique combinations of site-based patterns and processes create system properties that are context-dependent. The second theme is configuration, which focuses on the multidimensional structure of the ocean, including dynamic pelagic structure and benthic and geological structure. Structure can be conceptualized and mapped as patches, patch mosaics, edges, boundary layers, ecotones, and gradients in both time and space. A key premise is that seascape configuration influences ecological processes in ways that will be different if the configuration were different. Connectivity, the movement of things between locations. A wise old friend once said that connectivity is everything. Here, our premise is that connectivity is a vital process in seascapes and critical to ecosystem integrity. Consideration of scale, both temporal and spatial. Consideration of scale permeates all decisions in seascape ecology, from the formulation of research questions through methods and the interpretation and application of results. Much of our work is dependent on spatial data, and therefore understanding scale effects and scale dependency is essential. And from an organism perspective, our premise is that organisms perceive and respond to their environment in different ways and at different scales. The current thinking on connectivity in conservation planning has developed over the past 50 years from concepts, experiments and practice that is usually informed in some way by the theory of island biogeography or metapopulation ecology or landscape ecology. On land and in shallow coastal waters, the patch matrix and patch mosaic based approach features in the mainstream of biodiversity conservation. Here, core habitat or protected areas are connected by corridors. The IUCN guidelines recognise ecological corridors as a key component of ecological networks. Corridors are conceptualised as either linear and relatively homogeneous features, such as along a depth contour or a contiguous single patch type, or they can be configured as discontinuous patches of focal habitat that are referred to as stepping stones. For example, a collection of patch reefs distributed from inshore to offshore areas can facilitate safe passage of fish during spawning migrations. Corridors can also be composed of a mosaic of different patch types that provide the required resources to support different stages of the life cycle, such as for some fish that shift from nursery habitat to adult habitat across a mangrove seagrass coral reef mosaic. How organisms, materials and processes flow and interact among these structural elements of the seascape shapes biodiversity distributions, ecosystem integrity, resilience to disturbance and controls the quality and quantity of benefits to people. In the marine environment, however, we should also consider gradient corridors where movements flow across or along highly dynamic fluid features such as temperature, salinity or ocean productivity gradients or depth gradients. Some animal movements can be very predictable in space and time, particularly when undergoing seasonal migrations between feeding and breeding sites, or even routine daily home range migrations between day resting areas and night feeding areas. Here we can see a convincing case for a linear corridor evidenced by the satellite tracked movements of 20 humpback whales over a 15-year period. The whales undergo seasonal migrations between the rich foraging grounds in the Southern Ocean to the warmer coastal waters off the coast of Brazil for breeding and calving. With the recent rapid growth in telemetry studies, we now have reliable information on the movements of many thousands of animals worldwide. When we talk about seascape connectivity from a landscape ecology perspective, we're specifically referring to the way in which seascape and landscape patterns and processes interact to facilitate or impede the movements of material, organisms or genes across the seascape or between the land-sea interface. Connectivity is referred to as structural when only the physical spatial arrangement of seascape structure is considered, and functional when the response to the structure is also considered. This acoustic tracking study from the Caribbean island of St. Thomas demonstrates measurements of both structural and functional connectivity. Detailed habitat mapping revealed a large patch reef with potential to function as a movement corridor. That's the dark blue area on the map. But it wasn't until we manually tracked the movements of tagged grunts and snappers over several 24-hour periods that we could confirm the existence of an actual functional corridor linking the day and night segments of the fish's home ranges. In this case, it's the movement behaviour as a biological process that is interpreted as direct evidence of functional connectivity. And by combining movement data and seascape information, we can provide an opportunity for new ecological insights on seascape connectivity. There are now a bewildering array of analytical techniques available for modelling and mapping connectivity patterns. This figure shows how the different types of techniques vary in the detail and uncertainty they provide, and the data requirements and associated cost. Typically, the simple structural connectivity techniques, the yellow bars, are based on the spatial arrangement of structure represented in remotely sensed maps of the seascape. These can be rapid and cost effective, but typically they offer less ecological specificity than do potential connectivity techniques, here in green, such as network graphs and individual based models, which use some biological parameters. Actual connectivity techniques in blue, such as acoustic and satellite telemetry, are capable of providing the strongest evidence of connectivity pathways. The choice of techniques or combination of techniques, however, will depend on the objectives, data availability, time frame available and the budget. In general, the functional connectivity techniques are best where objectives are species specific. To help assess the pros and cons, a useful decision tree was provided by Keeley et al. 2021 in a paper in Biological Conservation. What's often left out of consideration is the value of local ecological knowledge on connectivity and participatory mapping, which can not only provide reliable information on marine connectivity, but also generates co-learning opportunities and the generation of culturally meaningful information on the importance of connectivity. This first case study demonstrates a rapid and simple way of integrating structural connectivity into the site selection and design of nature-based solutions in the tidal lagoon in the United Arab Emirates. The objective was to identify areas for protection and restoration with high potential for positive impacts for biodiversity conservation and multiple benefits, including carbon storage, food security, coastal protection and ecotourism. Connectivity was one of many data layers in a multi-criteria site selection framework developed with Emirates Nature WWF and government partners. Using a 100-metre square resolution habitat map derived from satellite data and ground validation, we identified parts of the lagoon where mangrove and adjacent subtidal seagrass existed within 500 metres of one another. A second data layer was created to identify the power of three by mapping areas with potentially synergistic interactions where mangrove and both subtidal seagrass and coral reefs coexist. Such a widely accessible approach can be used to design area-based actions for protection and restoration that maintain and optimise the synergistic potential of connected seascapes. Additional work is currently underway to evidence the implications of these seascape configurations for marine biodiversity using eDNA samples and underwater baited video surveys of marine megafauna, as well as sampling to quantify the spatial patterns of carbon sequestration and storage across the seascape. We have growing evidence from the global tropics to suggest that protected and connected coral reefs are happier reefs, but these reefs are often not prioritised for conservation actions. Several published studies from the researchers in Andrew Old's lab at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, have found that in the Western Pacific Ocean, coral reefs in marine reserves within 500 metres of mangroves supported as many as 10 times more fish than reefs that were more distant from mangroves. This protected and connected effect, i.e. the grey bars that you can see in the bar charts, was greatest for harvested fish and for herbivorous fish, suggesting some potential functional benefits for the replenishment function of marine reserves and for broader ecosystem resilience. In landscape ecology parlance, we refer to this localised synergistic boosting effect as seascape complementation, where access to the resources in adjacent patches is critical to local animal populations, or seascape supplementation, where the resources are beneficial but not necessarily critical. Localised boosting effects have also been found where seagrass beds coexist with mangroves and coral reefs. Building on their earlier findings, the Olds Lab researchers then applied a graph theoretic method frequently used in landscape ecology to identify, measure and rank the potential connectivity of patch mosaics of mangrove seagrass coral reefs in Moreton Bay, Queensland. The locations of the top 10 highest connectivity mosaics were then compared with the existing marine reserve network. Here they found that 7 of the top most highly connected mosaics, shown in red to orange on the map, were outside of the existing marine reserve network and therefore unprotected from fishing, with the remaining 3 receiving only partial overlap with the existing marine reserves, shown here on the map in light blue. In this study led by the Biogeography branch of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we tagged and tracked movements of 168 reef fish from 18 species using an acoustic telemetry array of underwater receivers across the insular shelf of St. Thomas and St. John in the US Virgin Islands. The red dots that you can see on the map are the receiver locations, and they're around inshore coral reefs both inside and outside of MPAs, and distributed across the shelf, including at shelf edge spawning aggregations. In total, the network included 225 receiver locations and yielded a database of 7.5 million detections over 3 years. A key objective was to understand fish movements relative to seascape structure and the existing MPAs. To predict potential movement pathways between the most distant receivers visited by an individual fish, we first converted our benthic map into a resistance surface with lowest resistance assigned to reef structures, followed by sand, and highest resistance for inaccessible deeper water and land. The potential pathways were then modelled using least cost paths and the lengths quantified. Here is an example of a least cost path for an adult mutton snapper, predicted to have moved 40 kilometres from inshore protected areas of the Virgin Islands National Park out across unprotected reef stepping stones to a shelf edge spawning aggregation at the Germanic Bank. So are Caribbean island MPAs big enough? Our reef fish tracking data estimated that 72% of fish could move more than a kilometre and 31% more than 5 kilometres. Island-based coral reef MPAs tend to be some of the smallest globally and were typically designed without the benefit of information on ecological connectivity. Based on measurements of the spatial dimensions of 33 no-take MPAs in the Eastern Caribbean, the average MPA area is estimated at 9.5 square kilometres, with 40% of no-takes being less than 1 square kilometre. Measurement of the MPA width and length shows that 85% of MPAs are narrower than 5 kilometres and 75% shorter than 5 kilometres in length. The effectiveness of these small and relatively narrow coastal MPAs will also, of course, depend on the habitat protected and the geomorphology of the shelf. But these results could indicate a potential mismatch between the scale of protection provided by no-take MPAs and the scales of movement for many reef fish. Our societal remit for connectivity conservation has been reinforced recently by Goal A of the new Global Biodiversity Framework and the associated targets. This IUCN concept diagram offers a vision of a well-connected coastal ecological network that considers land-sea connectivity and linkages with the wider seascape, ocean and landscape. And this may not yet exist in practice, but it is achievable. The 4 C's of seascape ecology, context, configuration, connectivity and the consideration of scale, can help in the design and evaluation of ecologically effective protected areas and ecological networks. The range and accessibility of knowledge, tools, technologies and data now enables us to measure, predict and map structural potential and actual connectivity to inform and accelerate the implementation of evidence-based ecological networks. Identifying and protecting nature's circulatory systems will help to achieve the targets that deliver Goal A of the Global Biodiversity Strategy. How we communicate connectivity conservation more broadly is going to be crucial to its implementation. Fortunately, the language of connectivity offers a rich tapestry of metaphors and analogies for connecting hearts and minds to the need to value and safeguard ecological connectivity. Consider, for example, the importance of our own body's circulatory system, or the meridians as energy pathways in the body from Eastern traditional medicine. We can also use words such as linkages, highways, swimways, flyways, networks, conduits, circuitry and corridors, of course. Connectivity is everything, the glue that binds ecosystems, the threads that weave together the living fabric of nature. As we race towards a 30 by 30 area target for MPAs, we should also evaluate what we can do to improve connectivity conservation both within and between existing MPAs, to inform expansions of existing MPAs and to better place new MPAs. We can identify and map key connectivity pathways that maintain species and ecosystem integrity both within and between MPAs and the surrounding seascapes and landscapes. We must assess the threats, barriers and opportunities to optimise effective connectivity conservation, and we must monitor and evaluate for adaptive management in a dynamic world. And of course, we must continue to reveal and communicate the ecological and cultural consequences of connectivity for all. Finally, I offer a list of future research areas where addressing knowledge gaps will serve to accelerate and promote effective connectivity conservation. So we should continue to work on evaluating assumptions and uncertainty with connectivity metrics and models. We should reveal the consequences of seascape connectivity for ecosystem services and deepen our understanding of land-sea connectivity and the nutrient and material pathways that flow across seascapes and from land to sea. We should make good use of artificial intelligence for predicting complex dynamics, including movement behaviour, and seek out opportunities for connectivity experiments by teaming up with active restoration projects, and better understand the impacts of light, noise and chemical pollution on marine connectivity. And of course, I highly encourage the application of the 4 Cs: context, configuration, connectivity, and the consideration of scale to MPA design and network design and coastal restoration. Thank you.